I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant, question more. Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride. The world according to Jesse. Today we're talking all about the new Red Scare in America. We just can't seem to repair relations with Russia, can we? Sit down. The show starts now. The world according to Jesse.
Welcome to The World According to Jesse. I'm your host, Brigida Santos. Now, during World War II, the United States and Soviet Union fought against a common enemy. After Germany fell and the war ended, hostilities between the nations resumed. Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe posed a new threat to U.S. hegemony in Western Europe, and so a geopolitical, ideological, and economic struggle ensued. During the Cold War, Europe, many Americans believed it was their job to stop the spread of communism at home. One of these people was U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy. As part of these efforts, McCarthy launched a national witch hunt, calling for the investigation of Americans with leftist or communist beliefs. Hundreds of people were accused of treason without any evidence, including liberal-leaning teachers, union leaders, activists, and filmmakers. The House Un-American Activities Committee, which carried out the investigations, was criticized for violating the First and Fifth Amendments. Other rights were also chipped away. With the Red Scare came the rise of the police state. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover launched America's first illegal surveillance program and a new counterintelligence program. Government employees were screened for loyalty, and suspected communists or communist sympathizers were jailed, blacklisted, and persecuted. Governor, back then, the hysteria convinced Americans that communists had infiltrated all aspects of American life. Does this sound familiar to you today with what's going on?
Absolutely. It sounds like we're reliving history again because we didn't bother to read it the first time and understand it. It's utterly ridiculous what's going on today. I'll give it to you from my perspective, Brigida. My mother and father were both World War II veterans. My mother was in North Africa as a nurse prior to Normandy. My father fought in North Africa, Normandy, Battle of the Bulge, Remagen Bridge, Anzio, and Berlin. And my father didn't talk much about the war, but he did talk about getting to Berlin finally and meeting up with the Russian army, their allies. Let me repeat, their allies, the Russian army. And my father told me how wonderful these Russian people were. And then lo and behold, the war is barely over and they're now our enemies. Why did they become our enemies? I believe this is the reason why. Because Russia was a socialist country. We were being run by capitalist Wall Street. Well, Wall Street's biggest fear is anything socialized, socialism. So therefore, before World War II was even hardly finished, we're already now against our Russian allies who truly did the major lifting in defeating the Nazis and winning World War II on the on the European front, I should say. So now we go through the Cold War, all of this that I had to live through, duck and cover and all this, and we come up to present day when truly we ought to look finally at what would it be like to be friends with Russia. After all, they're not communists now, are they? So there's no excuse for it. They are capitalists now, just like we are. Why not be friends? Let's see what we can accomplish as friends. We can always go back to being enemies.
Now, during the Red Scare, the House Un-Americans Activities Committee investigated a group of movie industry professionals for their suspected or known membership to the Communist Party. Many Americans had begun joining the party in the 1930s after the Great Depression, not because they wanted to serve the Soviet government, but because the Depression had triggered a loss of confidence in capitalism. Many Americans then turned to the Communist Party for a solution because it focused on economic, social, and justice reforms. But still, many people in Hollywood were blacklisted and jailed for their beliefs. More than 11,000 people lost their jobs, their government jobs, for alleged disloyalty, and over 100 people were prosecuted under the Smith Act for their involvement with the Communist Party. So, Governor, could this be one of the many reasons why we only have two political parties in this country?
I think absolutely that could be one of the major reasons. And you know, the other thing, Brigitte, we need to remember is, isn't this a great excuse to destroy the Bill of Rights, to destroy the First Amendment, freedom of speech, to destroy the amendment, I think the fourth or fifth, whichever one it is, about illegal search and seizure and putting us under surveillance and all that. See, governments use scare tactics like this to handcuff you and take away your freedom. They try to tell you they're doing it to protect you. That's their standard excuse. Oh, we're protecting you, but in order to protect you, we have to take away your freedom. It reminds me of a joke I saw one time where it showed a family of four sitting down at dinner, and they're all saying, gee, I sure feel safe now. And in the cartoon, they're all inside a jail cell. Well, of course you're safe. And if you're asking the government to protect you, and the only way they can protect you is by taking your freedom, I got news. I would rather be free and unprotected than protected and be put in jail. The world, according to Jesse.
Edward Murrow was one of the most notable critics of McCarthyism. Take a listen to what he said during a CBS newscast in 1953.
We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. We must remember always that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law.
Murrow went on to say that even unpopular causes have the right to be defended, and that Americans cannot defend freedom abroad if they can't even defend it at home. Governor, why is it so important to have influential people in the media like Murrow who can question those who are in power?
Because it gives the people the opportunity to hear another view of the situation. The more views of any situation, the better off you are. If you simply hear everything that happens in the world has at least two stories by it, if not three, four, or five. If you're only hearing one side of a story, how can you possibly make an intelligent decision about the story if you're not getting all the facts? Kudos to Ed for saying all that stuff, because that's the point. You know, when we sit here and say you're unpatriotic because you protest, you're unpatriotic unless you stand for the national anthem and all that type of stuff, let's remember something. Patriotism cannot be mandated by a government. It must be earned by the government. And mandating patriotism is a dangerous, dangerous thing, and we're facing that right now.
And we look back at Murrow now as if he was a hero, but today, when you're in the media, a member of the media, what happens if you call out Russian hysteria?
You'll probably lose your job. You'll be censored, because our media today, quote, our mainstream media in America, they're not doing their job. They were supposed to be the fourth branch of government, the branch of government that keeps an eye on the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branch and reports to the people. But when they're controlled by the very branches of government they're supposed to be keeping an eye on, that is the downfall of the United States as we know it. We need a free media, and right now we don't have it. Why? Because they're all owned by these massive corporations who are likewise running our country. And what is the definition of that? It's called fascism.
So what is the point of Red Scare hysteria? Why in America, where we're a country that cherishes the free expression of ideas, do people so vehemently oppose communism or any Russian point of view?
Because they've been brainwashed. Since you've been a little child going to school today, I lived through it, you were given the opinion, Russia bad, United States good. You were only getting one side of the story, weren't you? You need 2, 3, and 4 sides to that story to make a decision.
How is the fear-mongering right now shaping our political landscape?
Tremendously. That's all it is. I mean, look what you got out there. When these people are called rapists and all this other stuff, and and criminals and all that. You know, that's fear-mongering. That's governing by fear. And then you look at the situation with Russia now. Russia's now capitalistic. There is no reason anymore. And yet I hear Mitch McConnell say, Russia's no friend of ours. Well, why not? Imagine what we could do. I think Vladimir Putin subtly is crying out for the friendship, and we're slamming the door in his face. Why? For what? Well, you gotta look. The United States needs an enemy. We have to have an enemy to feed what? The military-industrial complex, which takes up roughly 50% of your tax dollars, goes to wage war. It's that simple. And so they're going to do whatever they can to keep bringing in their money, their end of the taxes. The only way they can do that is to have you scared and think there's a red menace out there out to get you, just like they did in the 50s when they all had us doing duck and cover. A lot of good that's going to do if the bomb gets dropped on you.
It's time for a quick break. When we return, CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou joins me to discuss the art of threat creation. Stay tuned.
The world according to Jesse.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome.
Real?
The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT
You
America.
guys do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
Yeah, he doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
For decades, the American middle class has been railroaded by Washington politics. Big money corporate interest has drowned out a lot of voices. That's how it is in the news culture in this country now. That's where I come in. I'm Ed Schultz. I do the news on RT America. I'll make sure you don't get railroaded and you'll get the straight talk and the straight news. Question more.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent countless hours poring through documents that tell the story about the ugliest side of corporate America. Corporate media refuses to talk about these issues.
The conduct by this company was deplorable.
I'm going to paint a clear picture about how disturbing, how corrupt corporate conduct has become in modern America. These are stories that no one else can tell. I'm Mike Papantonio, host of America's Lawyer. Question more.
The world according to Jesse.
In 2007, John Kiriakou became the first government official to confirm CIA torture tactics, including waterboarding. He's one of few people who has been charged and jailed in connection with the torture program, not for committing any torture himself, but for leaking classified information to the press. Over the course of his 14-year career in the agency, he served as an analyst and counterterrorism officer. He joins me now live. John, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to do it.
So from an intelligence agency insider's perspective, is there an art to creating a threat?
Oh, yes. An intelligence agency or an intelligence community has to have a threat around which to rally, because that's how budgets are determined and that's how manpower is allocated. So what good is an intelligence agency if there's no threat to counter? And you know, in the United States, we can go back even before the creation of the CIA in 1947. From the beginning of the 20th century, we've always had to have an ism, let's say, to rally against, whether it was anarchism or socialism or communism or Islamism. Well, we're rallying against a Russianism right now, is what it really comes down to.
Right. So the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the communist movement sort of died out then. why is it then that Russia is still such a threat to the United States?
Honestly, I don't think Russia is a threat to the United States. I think Russia very easily could be a partner of the United States, whether it's a defense partner or a counterterrorism partner or even an economic and trade partner. I think the United States has decided that it's better politically for us here at home to rally against the Russians. It's a political decision that's been made rather than a long-term strategic decision.
So right now, are we at war with Russia? A new Cold War, perhaps? It seems like we are.
I think we are in the midst of a new Cold War. The irony of this Cold War is that it is being backed and pushed by the Democrats rather than by the Republicans. You know, we see this normally as a Republican or a conservative foreign policy point. And indeed, we've got role reversal now where it's the Democrats leading the charge. I consider myself to be very active in liberal and democratic circles. And most of my friends, first of all, can't believe that I go on RT, for example, and give interviews. And secondly, they tell me like I'm stupid, like I don't understand. You don't realize, they say, that the Russians are the greatest threat to our safety and security in the world? And that's just preposterous. That's exactly what the Democratic Party today wants us to believe. And I'll give you another example. And I may sound like a broken record, so I apologize in advance. But just going back 15 or 16 years, the CIA, for example, told us that there was no torture program. We know that that was a lie. The CIA told us that there was no program for extraordinary rendition and kidnapping. That was a lie. The CIA told us that there was no archipelago of secret prisons around the world. We know that that was a lie. The CIA said that it had not hacked into the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence's computer system. That was a lie. Well, now they tell us that the Russians hacked into the Democratic National Committee email system. They offer no evidence, and they tell us to take their word for it. Well, I'm sorry. Over the last decade and a half, the CIA has consistently lied to the American people. So why in the world would we believe them on this?
So let me ask you this then. How is this really to benefit the military-industrial complex, creating this threat perception?
Sure it is. Since the September 11th attacks, we have transitioned into a full-time wartime economy, a permanent wartime economy. It's no accident that the largest concentration of millionaires in the United States is in Washington, D.C. and its suburbs. It used to be in Silicon Valley, which made sense. Now it's in Washington. Why? Because we have so many defense and intelligence contractors getting rich off of these boogeymen that we've set up as straw men around the world.
So is this new Red Scare hysteria justified? Should Americans be taking this seriously, or how does this play in a historical context?
No, I don't think anybody should be taking this seriously. If we have problems with the Russians, and sure, we have very genuine policy differences with the Russians, then we should sit down at the negotiating table and work this out. Remember, if you look just at terrorism, for example, we have a lot in common with the Russians, and we should be working hand in glove with the Russian government on issues related to terrorism. That, in and of itself, ought to open other avenues of cooperation. But we're not pursuing those avenues. Instead, it's more politically expedient for us here in the States to make the Russians into the bad guy and then to play to our own domestic political audiences.
Now, talk about the Vault 8 revelations. WikiLeaks is now releasing the source code from alleged CIA spy tools. Do you know anything about those?
Vault 8 took place long after I left the CIA, but I can tell you that in a perfect world, I would say, oh, you know, this information should have been kept secret because we're using it to target our enemies. Now, with what I know about the CIA, with what I lived through with the CIA, I think this ought to be made public. First of all, legally and ethically, the American people have a right to know what the government is doing in their name, right? We have a right. The American people own that information just by virtue of the fact that they're Americans and the government is producing the information. So with that said, we know through the Vault 7 revelations that the operations created by the CIA can be used domestically and can be used against American citizens. The CIA, if it wants to, can hack into our smart TVs, can take over control of our cars by hacking into them. And to do what? Why would you want to take over control of a car? To drive it off a cliff? To drive it into a tree? Who knows? Right. Well, I, for one, don't trust my government. I wish I could, but I don't. And so I think we have a right to know what the government is able to do against us.
Right. What do you think about the state of journalism now? Anybody who is adversarial, doing reporting against the government, or revealing, I should say, things that the government is doing, why are they all labeled Russian stooges?
Right, right. This is really a crisis in journalism. And it's not related just to Russia. You know, we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years really the death of investigative journalism. The big papers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they just don't have the investigative budgets that they used to have. And so the big stories aren't getting covered. Then you have websites like ProPublica, which devotes itself just to investigative journalism. And that's fantastic. And ProPublica has won a myriad of journalism awards. But then people say, oh, it's a liberal website, it has no credibility. Or it's fake news. Well, I blame the president for that. Sure, there is such a thing as fake news. Right. But you can't label as fake news anything that you don't agree with or anything that makes you look bad. And so I think in our current contemporary political environment, the White House and those around Donald Trump have really done damage to the Fourth Estate. They've done damage to journalism. It's something that we're going to have to try to get past.
So what are the similarities between the Red Scare of, let's say, the 50s when all of this McCarthyism started coming out? Are we just seeing a repeat of that? Is it worse today? Is it comparable?
I don't think it's worse today. I think that it's comparable to the very beginning of McCarthyism. I hope that people are better equipped today to stand up to those pointing a finger and saying that there's a Russian behind every rock. That's just simply not true. It's a way to explain away our own failures. But again, this is a very dangerous development and something that we have to fight against. I'm taken aback by how many of my friends think that the Russians are behind everything that goes wrong in this country. And these are people who are lifelong progressives and lifelong Democrats. And they just buy the whole Russian narrative hook, line, and sinker. So it's up to the rest of us to prove that this is nonsensical, that it's politically driven and politically motivated, and put a stop to it.
Right, proof is the important part here.
Proof is the important thing.
And also historical context. Why is it important for young people to understand the history that the United States and Russia have had when it comes to their relationships going back in time?
I think everybody should learn history so that we're not doomed to repeat it, as the old saying goes. At the same time, we can learn from history, and we cannot make the same mistakes that have been made in the past. Besides that, we can look to see what the similarities and the differences are between what happened in the 1950s, for example, and what's happening now. We haven't gone down the rabbit hole yet. There's still time for us to save ourselves and make this right. And I think that really this rests on the shoulders of millennials, because they're the ones, and I'm going to use a cliche here, they're the ones that are going to lead us into the next decade and into the decade after that. I'm amazed at how many times I go to events, whether they're demonstrations or seminars or what have you, and it's the millennials that are actually taking the lead in these events. So we've got to look to millennials for leadership on this issue, and the only way they can really lead is to educate themselves.
Right, so you propose that as the way forward?
I do. Listen, people my age, I'm 53 years old, people my age are set in their ways, and they're set in their ideologies, and they're set in their politics, and they're not going to change. But younger people can affect the change and can force the change, and we have to rely on them to lead us.
All right, is there anything else that you want to add about this topic, about the new Red Scare?
Yeah, you know, I think everybody should do their own research. Fake news can be real, right? We have evidence of fake news. But if something strikes you as wrong, then do your own research, for God's sake. Google it, see what's out there, and look for respectable and respected outlets that you can count on. Don't just believe what your friends post on Facebook. It's just going to get us down into a hole.
Right. Well, thank you so much, John Kiriakou. Great conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
The world according to Jesse.
All right, Governor, it's time to let our fans weigh in. We asked, will the U.S. and Russia ever be allies? What would it take to normalize relations? Doc says, without the threat of Russia, the U.S. will not have a reason to increase military spending, which is a source of money for the real power. So no.
I got to agree with him. I think absolutely that's why they need the Red Menace out there, is to feed the furnace of the military-industrial complex. We have to have an enemy. You got the 4 Green Berets that were now killed in Africa, so get ready. That's going to be the next war zone, Africa. It's going to go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. We are a country today and a culture of war. We have to be at war at all times now.
Mike McKinney says we could be allies. It's all about finding common interests for our people and working toward a better future for all of them.
Absolutely, and there's no reason. As I've said before, why don't we try being allies? You know, we've been enemies for so long, my entire life. If we became allies for a while, think of the things that Russia and us could accomplish together. But then again, you know, will it happen? Doubtful, because again, you got to have a common enemy, and we are a war culture. Take a look at the ads during football games to these video games and how they glorify war as being the great honorable thing. War is man at his lowest level. There is nothing at all honorable about war.
All right, Governor, final thoughts. Why is it so important for Americans to understand the historical context of U.S.-Russia relations? Could it potentially ease this hysteria?
Absolutely it could. You know, again, we need to hear the story from more than one side of the story. I mean, if we are mad at Russia for something, you can bet if you ask Russians, they would say the same thing back to us. Give you a quick example. I was out in L.A., and all my drivers happened to be Russian when I was out there with the cars that were driving me around. They were all relatively within my age group. I asked them all, during the height of the Cold War, what were you being told in Russia? And they all said the same thing. We were told we had to stop the capitalist imperialist takeover of the world. Does that sound familiar? We were being told here in America we had to stop the domino effect of communism. So some entity out there was telling both sides the same story so that they could get us to hate each other. I think it's time we like each other and tell this entity to go to hell.
I agree. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Send us your comments on Facebook and Twitter for a chance to be featured next week when we discuss the cultural divide.
That's right. The battle to define America rages on in the United States. But who gets to define what it means to be an American? We take a look at what's driving the culture wars next week. Until then, when government lies, the truth becomes a traitor. Stay vigilant. I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant. Question more.
Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride.
The world according to Jesse.